Guilliman's having a bad week this week, first lain low by an Orc war boss, and now along comes a Blood Angel's captain who can super reliably punch him into the dirt for just 90 points and a little support. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Blood Angels once more, and in this video I thought it would be fun to focus on a ridiculously dangerous Smash captain, who when empowered by a bit of red thirst, can be easily ruining the day of Primarch and Knight class models out there in Warhammer 40k. This one maybe does feel like a very slight return to form of the Blood Angel Smash captain that was an absolute terror on the tabletop in 8th edition. At that point it tended to be jump captains with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, bounding in using Red Rampage and stratagem tricks to fight twice, one rounding things like Imperial Knights and anything smaller, with not too much that you could do about them. It looks like today in the recent codex though, one of the best builds revolves around the captain on foot, who was already really quite a strong choice for the Blood Angels pre-codex. He was often seen with a power fist jumping out of an impulsor and fighting alongside some assault intercessors. It's kind of interesting that once again we're talking about a big damage combo that's very good at using the combat patrol units like the Orc War Boss Beast Boss video that I made earlier in the week. The shorthand note though is that if there's a Blood Angel Smash captain with Rage Fueled Warrior, he can be dialed up to just insane levels of strength and basically have 90 points worth of model threaten to do something like 300 points worth of damage to certain units, potentially more if he's backed up by some assault intercessor cheerleaders. First up, let's start with the captain datasheet himself. This one's going to be using the Blood Angels captain datasheet, though it's basically the same as the one from Codex Space Marines. 80 points for a standard issue captain, 5 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 with a power fist in melee, and he certainly could take either the power weapon or the chainsword if you really wanted to with this combo. I thought we'd stick with the power fist for this one, maybe just for being a bit more general purpose after his big turn of damage is done. As ever, one of the biggest benefits of captains is the -1 command point stratagem that he can give for his units, though if anything it's maybe a bit of a nice to have and a sideshow to this one, but it does mean that he could do things like advance and charge for free, re-roll a failed charge potentially, use Red Rampage for lance and lethal hits if his target warrants it, or even just throw a grenade in if all you want is a few extra mortal wounds, and that's going to be the main way that you can threaten the target. More relevant for making him into a brutal murder character is the one massive turn of melee that he can get once per game. You declare it at the start of the fight phase, and he gains 3 attacks and devastating wounds, so really quite a lot scarier for that one, and that already makes him a fairly good unit in their own right that was certainly being used pre-codex, and that puts his attacks up to 8 attacks at strength 8, AP 2, damage 2 and devastating wounds, already quite threatening. Then the Blood Angels just have a crazy amount of layers of damage that you can add to this guy. Perhaps the main one for the combo is Rage Fueled Warrior, basically a once per game melee damage enhancement that stacks really well with the base captain ability. It's only a 10-point enhancement, and at that point's cost it's fairly efficient. Like the innate captain ability, you trigger it once per game, and that gets you a big sustained hits 3 on the melee attacks, so kind of swingy depending on whether you roll 1/6 multiple 6s or no 6s. But just on average, in theory land, it's a plus 60% boost to your damage output, and to amplify the value of those extra attacks that he can get once per game, so you basically get a plus 60% from the core plus 3 attacks, and an extra 60% from the sustained hits as well. And due to the percentages multiplying, it means that on average you're hitting around about 2.5 times as well as he would have been doing just on his base profile, plus also the devastating wounds, which definitely adds a bit of value as well. Then to add further to all of that, there's the Blood Angel's Red Thirst, so plus 2 strength and plus 1 attack there, so it's up to 9 attack space with those sustained hits at strength 10. And then depending on what other free stratagems he's using, he could trigger Red Rampage. Might depend on whether or not it's needed on him to overwhelm his target or elsewhere, and whether or not he might have used his free stratagem on advance and charge potentially. But if we are just seeing what he could do, seeing as he can trigger it completely for free, he could get both lethal hits and lance if he's willing to accept Battle Shock, or just take one or the other as it might make sense. Then between those three we've already got a rather spectacularly dangerous captain, but we can certainly add on some massive rerolls to the mix. Oath of Moment usually doesn't make too much sense for using on units that hit on a 2+, but due to the sustained hits this guy's an exception, and it means that if you trigger Oath of Moment against his targets, you can reroll everything that isn't a 6, giving him far more chance at those massively boosted attacks. A lot more reliability with that, and though it is a big commitment, it really takes him to an entirely next level. Then, likely as not, he's going to want a squad to lead, a nice cheap retinue with good objective control and some volume attacks, and assault intercessors also help out with giving their rerolls to the character attached as well, so again they're one of the squads that buffs the character while he buffs the squad. It means that they'll be able to reroll 1s to wound against all targets, and the captain's able to do that too. Often reroll 1s to wound is all you might need if, say, a Power Fist was attacking anything that's toughness 7 or lower with Red Rampage on the go. But it goes up to 4 rerolls to wound against things on an objective. That's great for basically any attacks in 40k of course, but super great against tough stuff, and really good for the captain in particular, given that he might be able to reroll anything that isn't a devastating wound if you just want to fish for them. Altogether, if you add that all up, if you just took the captain's damage alone, completely ignored the squad, and then decided just to set one unit in his sights for absolutely maximal damage dealing, taking aim at something nasty that's just taken a mid-board objective, declaring it as the Oath of Moment target, and throwing this murderous captain against him, this is what you get. At base he's 9 attacks, at weapon skill 2+ with strength 10, AP 2 and damage 2, sustained hits 3 and lethal hits, re-rolling everything that isn't a 6. So averages just over 13 hits with a standard roll, with around 3 auto wound hits, or you could just have 16 hits in general if you didn't want to use the lethals. Then on the wound roll, his strength 10 with a +1 to wound, re-rolling all the wound rolls if it's against a target on an objective, and against something like say an Armor of Contempt Land Raider, you could just fish for the devastating wounds, re-rolling literally everything that isn't a 6. Just for the captain absolutely on his own, he'll be able to take down an entire horde if he wants to, killing around about 16 Termagant equivalents, slaying around about 11 standard sized Space Marines, 4 or 5 Terminators all by himself, even if the damage 2 doesn't go into them very well. Against the Primarch of the Ultramarines, he takes around about 17 wounds of Rebute Guilliman, so fairly comfortably knocking him in the dirt, and trying to see if the Armour of Fate can get him back up again. 19 wounds to a Chaos Knight, which the rest of the squad should easily be able to make up the difference to take that down. And then about 13 wounds to an Armor of Contempt's Land Raider, one of the single hardest targets around in 40k. So pretty massive that one 90-point model can do so much work against it, even with taking a bit of investment. Overall the damage output is pretty crazy, even if it is a sort of one and done type thing, as he won't get the big sustained hits or the big plus attacks on another phase, though he still just returns to being basically a normal Blood Angels melee marine squad with a couple of scary power fists in it, which still is no thing to underestimate with the buffs that they can get. Before we move on to the other things that you can do for the unit, I'll just quickly give a shout out to the video sponsor, Great Eye Studio, and their Crimson Lords upgrades. One third-party 3D printed option for giving your Blood Angels Marines a little bit more flair with a whole bunch of custom bits. They had a recent wildly successful Kickstarter, and now they've got a whole bunch of physical bits and parts for sale on their Only Games page, basically packs of bits to upgrade various different Space Marines, shipping worldwide from the UK. I personally quite like their options. They've got a whole bunch of themed heads, including things like Death's Mask, winged helms, and ones that could represent Death Company. A whole ton of themed shoulder pads with chalices, wings, and big crosses on them. Themed weapons such as hammers and shields, these could be okay for Assault Terminators or Blade Guard maybe. And the way that they're available is in a bunch of bits packs. There's a core set that has a good mix of things like the heads and shoulder pads and things. A Sacred Pack that seems aimed at new style Sanguinary Guard, returning some cool winged jump packs and having a bunch of fun melee weapons. And a fun or very skull-laden upgrade set that could work for a Death Company Dreadnought. This one's compatible with the Brutalis Dread. In any case, I'll link them down in the video description below, and take a look at a couple more of their bits packs at the end of the video as well, if you wanted to see a little bit more of their range. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Returning to Big Blood Angels damage combos though. Next up, we can add in the squad's damage. On the charge, your Assault Intercessors get 20 attacks at Strength 6, AP 1, Damage 1, and 4 attacks at Strength 10, AP 2 and Damage 2 for the Power Fist Sergeant. All that'll be hitting on 3s, re-rolling all the hits if they're also hitting the Oath of Moment target, getting lethal hits and wound re-rolls as well, and +1 to wounds. The damage output feels like it's getting a bit meaningless against more standard issue Space Marines and things, given that you're certainly wiping out the vast majority of normal Horde units or normal 2-wound Marine squads with the captain's output alone. But between the two of them, you average around about 7 or 8 slain Terminators overall, the low AP being a bit of a weakness there admittedly, but the squad's damage added in adds up to around about 30 wounds on a standard Imperial or Chaos Knight, so pretty mad stuff being able to fairly easily and reliably scrap a big knight in a single turn for 165 points plus Oath of Moment. Then finally looking at an Armor of Contempt's Land Raider, the squad's damage puts you up to an average of around about 17 wounds or so. So not really guarantees to one-shot that, but if it had taken a little bit of damage before, a fairly good chance. And again, that's all rather impressive for charging into one of the most infamously tough things in the game. Might just need to watch out for a bit of Overwatch though if it happens to be a Redeemer. In reality though, it might just make sense to multi-charge things, throw the captain against the primary target, where unless it's something incredibly tough, there's a good chance that you just one round it with his damage output alone, and then do your best to get as much of the squad into a secondary charge target as possible, where all those chainsaw attacks should pretty comfortably blend something like a squad of objective holders, or stack a bunch of damage on just something else entirely. It means you have a pretty reasonable chance to one round one big scary thing and take off an objective grabbing unit at the same time if they happen to be obligingly close enough together. Otherwise, besides perhaps the obvious one that I went for this one, there seemed like there'd be a bunch of other options that you could do something similar with. First up, you could question whether or not he actually really needs to lead a unit, and he could just use him as basically a lone smash captain, going in and utterly pummeling something to death with that power fist, then accepting that he's very expendable, and if the opponent happens not to kill him that same turn, then it's a bit of a positive, but otherwise it's kind of fine to lose a 90-point character after you've just destroyed something far bigger. He'd still be able to use his free stratagem, so you could get Red Rampage if you wanted to, or Advance and Charge. The biggest thing that he'd lose would be the wound rerolls if they matter against the target, which could mean that he's not quite as strong against things like big toughness 12 stuff, and wouldn't have the option to fish for devastating wounds, and he also wouldn't have the bonus chainsaws, extra fist, and the objective control and bodies and defense. But if you used Oath of Moment, you'd still be hitting out with a massive 16 strength 10 power fist hit with average rolling, which is going to end the life for a bunch of squads out there, and you still have +1 to wound and devastating wounds on that. If you attack something important enough, you're still very likely to be one rounding something and easily justifying his points for the damage. Otherwise, the sustained hits and oath combo could also work really quite nicely for other characters as well. Again, could just give them an enormous melee turn, you just wouldn't get the +3 attack bonus that makes the captain stand out for that. For example, you can maybe use it on a Judas here, which is a little bit of a cheaper character. You wouldn't have the 3 stratagems or the big 9 attacks, but you'd still be averaging 11 hits at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2 on the charge, and then you've got a unit that can fight first and return, which definitely seems like it has interesting options and could be really disruptive. Maybe the lieutenant could be okay, though I still feel like probably the captain's the standout one. Otherwise, you could focus the captain entirely to build for devastating wound output. Taking a power sword or chainsword could get you extra attacks, and I'm not sure if this necessarily makes sense given that he wouldn't be quite as well rounded on later turns, but just in theory land with a big devastating wound turn and the full rerolls from assault intercessors, you could be averaging 12 mortal wounds on average to any target in the game on a mid-board objective, though it doesn't really seem that outperforms the power fist with the red rampage buffs. Otherwise, as well as just the small squad that we looked at that does seem like it will be able to destroy the majority of things out there in 40k, you could certainly build out to a bigger unit, build up to say 10 assault intercessors plus the captain, or even add in a sanguinary priest for a bit of AP on the intercessor attacks, or even do both if you want a big chunky squad that's got lots of bodies and a feel no pain after they've basically one-rounded anything that they touch. It does seem though that if you're going for the big damage combo, if you go for anything besides just a regular squad of intercessors, you're probably going to be into ridiculous glorious overkill against the vast majority of targets, so the real thing might be more about how much damage and durability they have when the enemy strikes back. Otherwise, for the Blood Angels, the squad at least seems fairly easy to get into close combat when you need to. For a 5-man with a captain, the Impulsor seems absolutely fine. A cheap 80-point transport to act as a staging point, get out 3 inches, and maybe use the Advance and Charge stratagem for an average 20-inch threat range out of an Impulsor. That could have some scary first turn charge threat if the opponent pushes up with something important, or maybe more likely move into the mid-board and then threaten that for turn 2. Or otherwise you could maybe use a Land Raider if you wanted a big squad perhaps, the same sort of delivery distance but a lot more armour and reliability. Or you could just foot slog and charge out from behind terrain. Overall though, going forward I could easily see these guys being a fairly easy to use Blood Angels unit, compared to massive supported squads of Death Company or Sanguinary Guard, not really costing all that many points, but when maximally buffed still hitting just about as hard as one of those units, with enough damage to one round most things. For the points cost, they're not going to be super easy to gun down, but also won't go down without at least a little bit of focused fire. They do have a bunch of wounds, an okay save, plus the captain's invulnerable save. Plus, if it happens to be the Blood Angels player who's going second, the captain could maybe use his free stratagem for the next battle round as a nice free Armour of Contempt, to at least make them soak up a little bit more firepower as they take shots. All the power does come with a few limitations though, I suppose. They are a fair bit slower than the Blood Angels' jump infantry threats, and they might be competing for the same sort of cover to hide those units in. They're only going to have the one super standout turn of melee, and it could be a bit sad if it just makes sense for them to charge something that's not really all that high value and kill that, and then wind up getting destroyed in return, so they never get to realise that enormous damage potential. I can't help but think that the majority of opponents are going to try and keep their tough stuff back and out of range of this if they can. And finally there's the downside of the rerolls. Without Oath at the moment the captain's damage drops considerably, though it's still scary obviously. And if they don't happen to be charging a unit on an objective, the squad's not going to do anywhere near quite as much catastrophic damage to big tough stuff that's say T11 or higher. It does mean that sometimes they might have some slightly awkward decisions to make as to what they go for, whether they're maximising damage and risking falling short, or whether or not you're brave enough to put Oath elsewhere, as they'll be able to kill what they charged anyway. In any case though, they certainly look like a pretty terrifying unit for the Blood Angels right now. Seems that on-foot captains with assault intercessors are still going to be a really scary threat out there. And again, always fun when one character can just be dialed up to crazy levels of damage if you give him a whole load of boosts and bloodlust. In any case, looking forward to your takes on the Danger Captain. Have you used something like him in game yet or not, or played against him, and if so, what was the result? Finally, I'll just cycle back to the Crimson Lords and Grey Tide studio and the video sponsor just to take a look through a few more of their sets, a whole bunch of 3D printed upgrades and things that can be ordered in online and can add a bit more Blood Angels feel to some Space Marines. As well as the ones mentioned earlier, they also have a Rage pack. This one could add some Death Company themed parts, which seems to be a real gap in what Games Workshop's doing at the moment, seeing as they basically don't sell Death Company in any way, shape or form. Even the Blood Angels upgrade sprue that's supposed to represent them doesn't have the cross shoulder pads or anything like that, which just felt like a really weird decision. Maybe they'll get some plastic sculpts at a later date. Otherwise, they've got a couple of fun character packs. There's a Medic pack that could do okay for representing a Sanguinary Priest. Lots of themed bits that could be combined with a basic Space Marine of some sort. And here's a Battle Priest pack. You can see it modelled combined with a few of the other bits and painted up very nicely, I must say. It could be another alternative for realising some fun jump chaplains if you want a little bit more theming, although I admit the Games Workshop plastic one is a rather nice one. Otherwise, as mentioned before, if you just want a whole bunch of themed bits, they've got their core set with head, shoulder pads, loincloths and backpacks and things. A Sacred pack for some golden armoured elites with wings, and an Ancient pack of Dreadnought compatible upgrades to swap out a few panels for something a little bit more Black Rage themed. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out all the links down in the video description if you think that any of them could be useful for your army. In any case, I'll leave this one here for now. Let me know your thoughts as to the combo down in the comments below, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. Otherwise, besides the Blood Angels things, there's a few other ways to support the channel down in the video description, the channel Patreon page for a few things like entry to the giveaways and things, and all the affiliate discount links for cheaper Warhammer in a way that supports the channel. Feel free to check any of those out, and a massive thank you to anyone supporting. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.